Let me go ahead and click the record button. And Brandon, would you mind opening us up in a word of prayer?
Well, God, we thank you so much for this time together of fellow believers who are looking towards your word for truth and enlightenment. And we pray that our time we have set apart to study your word together would be fruitful, and whatever messages you want us to receive, that we would receive, that we would have a true understanding of your word, and that we'll be able to apply it to our lives. And we thank you for everyone who is here today. In Yeshua's name we pray.
Amen. Okay, let me go ahead and share here. So I thought we'd start today just a quick kind of overview of the big topics we hit last week. We spent a lot of time in Deuteronomy 32, talking about the Song of Moses. And I was talking with my buddy Jeremiah last weekend, who's in Colorado. And he was just talking about how he was having a conversation with a friend of his the other day, who he's been sharing with a little bit about, Sabbath and what they do. And he just he mentioned the Song of Moses, that he just felt like the entire gospel was in the Song of Moses. And just the idea of God choosing, choosing people and people going astray, but always that repentance, and that ability to turn back to God. And over throughout all the prophets, you see this turn back to God. You see it in Joel, and we see it in Amos. If you turn back to him, he will relent. And there's always mercy there. And so, it just was interesting, hearing him call it the gospel. And it really is. I mean, it's glad tidings, And the gospel is not always glad tidings. I think that's something else, to keep in mind. That tidings, is whatever message we need to hear from God. That's the gospel. And Deuteronomy 32 really, kind of points that out. There's good and what people would say is bad. But as we go through Amos a little bit today, these are kind of the 5 themes we'll look out for. And it'd be great to hear what you guys, if you saw any of these themes, maybe more than others stick out, or maybe you were able to kind of see all 5 of them in there. But again, the Lord chooses Israel and cares for her as a bride. That's a very common theme in the prophets. Pride and haughtiness lead to rebellion and lead to idolatry. God's anger is poured out on Israel. The nations are both used as a tool to bring judgment against Israel. And God's mercy toward his people will eventually come, and it comes continuously because he is a God of mercy. And someday his anger will turn towards the nations for the things that they have done wrong. We also talked about the 4 forms of judgment, that when God talks about bringing judgment against, whether it's the nations or it's against Israel in judgment, he's not a respecter of persons, and it takes the same form, whether it's his own people or it's other people. We see plague and pestilence, we see famine and lack of rain. We see the sword and war, and even instances of wild beasts or poisonous, snakes and scorpions, things like that. So those were kind of the big highlights. And again, that's recorded. So if you weren't able to watch it, you definitely can. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about just more of the history and kind of focus in on the split, Solomon's sin. Just really quickly, I think we'll hit that. Hopefully everyone's had a chance to read that, and then after Solomon, why 10 of the tribes symbolically were taken from the house of David and given to Jeroboam, and Jeroboam's sin, the things he did with idolatry, and kind of how that carried through. Israel was really never able to overcome Jeroboam's sin, and they continued in it all the way up until their exile into Assyria. So we'll talk a little bit about that, and then the prophets of kind of that time. And so again, what we're trying to do is split basically the period of Israel into 4 parts. And you kind of have this first part here, which is what we're going to focus on today, and maybe next meeting if we don't get through it today. But you have this part where the kingdoms are divided, but there's still a house of Israel and a house of Jerusalem, all the way up into the Assyrian captivity of the northern kingdom. So that'll be phase 1. Phase 2, what I'm calling phase 2, again, this is all the verbiage I'm using, is kind of from the time that Israel's taken captive in exile to the time that that the temple is destroyed and Babylon comes in and takes the southern kingdom. And so that'll kind of be phase 2, and that'll probably take some time. There's a lot of prophets in that area. And then you have kind of what I called phase 3, which is Daniel's time in exile, the 70-year captivity in Babylon. And then phase 4, the second temple era, up until Yeshua. So again, that's going to take some time. We'll see how fast we can get through it. You don't want to go too fast, but you also don't want to go too slow. So always as a teacher, and we got a lot of teachers in this group, you guys all know that you're always trying to balance what's too slow and what's too fast. So yeah, so let me go through I think, and then maybe we'll talk just a little bit about summaries or observances from the book of Amos specifically, and then we'll get into the book of Amos. We're going to start though in 2 Samuel 7, and I'll have everything on screen, but Dorinda and Bobby, we love all translations because, it's good to see and hear the different translations and try to piece out which one really captures something good. Brandon and I tend to be NASB guys, but we both have recognized and talked about many times the NASB gets it wrong. There's even a couple times, I feel like the NIV gets it best, and a lot of traditionalists can't stand the NIV, but there's times when I feel like the NIV gets it better than the KJV or any of the others. So anyway, I just say that so that you guys know that what I have on screen here is the NASB, but by no means do I think that the NASB is the one, and we've talked about that many times. All right. So 2 Samuel 8, I'm just going to read through this real quick to try to get us moving. And again, this is kind of just hit this so we kind of know what happened. And this is God's covenant with David, which started kind of Israel's course, really was founded on this covenant. And in verse 10, this is God speaking through his prophet to David. I will appoint a place for my people Israel and will plant them, that they may live in their own place and not be disturbed again. Nor will the wicked afflict them anymore as formerly, even from the day that I commanded judges to be over my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. The Lord also declares to you that the Lord will make a house for you. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will come forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be a father to him, and he will be a son to me. When he commits iniquity, I will correct him with the rod of men and the strokes of the sons of men. But my loving kindness shall not depart from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed from before you. Your house and your kingdom shall endure before me forever, and your throne shall be established forever. So you have God's covenant, and I think, we're all very familiar with this covenant. It's a very important covenant, throughout the church's history. It's always one of the focuses in the Old Testament. But a couple things that stick out to me, that he specifically talks about Solomon, and Solomon being the one who will build the temple. And we know that's exactly how that went down. He talks about the iniquity of his son, that he will use the rod of men to discipline him, and that the house would be there, through his line, that basically his line will be established forever. And so we're going to see when he goes and talks to Solomon about Jeroboam, or he goes to Jeroboam and gives him his message, that continues, and that promise has never failed, and we know what the end is going to be, and that in the end time that promise will be fully fulfilled. I don't know if anybody has any comments, questions, observances on that before I move on to the next part.
Justin,
Yeah.
saying that 2 Samuel chapter 8.
Is that 2 Samuel 8?
Yeah, is that what
Okay.
you said? I can't find it in my
It's,
Bible.
you know what? It's 2 Samuel 7 is what I said.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That 8 up there, so it confused me. Okay, that's fine. Doesn't take much at this time of the morning. It makes more sense.
Okay. Yeah, and so Solomon, we're gonna kind of jump here over to 1 Kings 13. And this is kind of the back end of Solomon's life. And we know that Solomon, with his many wives, he committed great iniquities in the sight of God towards the end of his life. And this is, something that, I mean, I've talked about this with so many within people in this group, people with my group from Denver, that really understanding Israel and the two houses in the divided kingdom is just, if you guys remember when we started this study, the point here is not to necessarily hit every, prophet, at least not at first, but to just kind of give us entry points into understanding the word of God on a deeper scale, specifically the prophets. And to me, I don't know how you could understand any of the prophets without really understanding that the history of the two houses, and what God's plan is both for the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and the reunification. And it's amazing how much of the New Testament contains this thing. But my whole life growing up, and I was a reader. I mean, I always have, had my nose in the Word of God, but I just missed it, and it's not something that is focused on in many churches today. So, yeah, and so this is, just a very, very important part of this, and it's just something that I would call a foundation to just understanding who God is and who His people are and how He views them, and definitely an entry point into understanding the prophets, because even in Amos you can see he talks about Israel and he talks about Judah and he talks about them separately, but many of the prophets also talk about them together. So Israel's a hard word in the Bible because sometimes Israel's Israel all, and sometimes Israel is just the northern kingdom, and so it's it takes context and really a breadth of knowledge of the Bible to really kind of differentiate which one's which. All right.
The split is mostly the northern kingdom, though, isn't it?
I think so. In the Old Testament, it absolutely is. I think of Paul when Paul talks about, so shall all of Israel be saved, and just there's instances where I think it's talking, it's kind of encompassing all of God's people. And Paul makes it clear that not all Israelites are Israel, right? But
she does that too. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, but you're right. I think in the Old Testament, most of the time in the Kings, the Chronicles, and the Prophets, when it talks about Israel, it is specific to the northern kingdom.
And also, Paul is very specific that Gentiles are grafted into Israel.
Yeah.
And as I tell people, he's a lawyer, and so they're very specific about what they say. He doesn't say grafted into the Jews, he says into Israel, which I think is significant.
Yeah. No, I agree. So here it talks about, Solomon, the many foreign women he loved. And he talks about Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite. And so, just really quickly, I think, well, I'll show it to you on the next slide. I'm going to show you guys, and it's in there if you've had a chance to look at it, a map of Israel, kind of from Solomon's time to the Assyrian captivity. It shows the surrounding nations. And we're going to that's one of the things we're going to do is spend time figuring out who those people come from. Where in the book of Genesis and the table of nations in Genesis, I think it's Genesis 10 is the table of nations, but where those people come from is a very important part. So we'll talk about that. But it's these nations that cause the fall, a part of the reason that Israel ends up falling. And so in verse 9, and again, we're in 1 Kings 13. It says, now the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice and had commanded him concerning this thing, that he should not go after other gods. But he did not observe what the Lord commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes, which I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and I will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. And so it's interesting that he says both it's for the sake of David and for the sake of his temple, for the fact that that's his sanctuary, that that's the land he chose to have, the temple built in. And we're going to see here that Jeroboam tries to kind of take his people and kind of do his own thing. And it's considered great sin in the eyes of God. But I did find that interesting, that it's both for the sake of Jerusalem and for David, that southern kingdom is going to exist and continue in the line of David.
We're a little lost. We
Chapter.
Yeah,
It's chapter 11, Justin.
Are we in 2 Kings or 1 Kings?
1 Kings 13. Sorry.
1 Kings 13. Maybe it's just the way it's written differently.
And you know what? I in fact, when I went back, I think I had to change one of these. This might be 1 Kings. This might be the one. Is this the wrong heading here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's 11.
It's 11.
Oh, it's 11.
So I changed that in my copy. I remember going, because this week I was studying and realized that one of them was off, and I changed it, but I think I had already exported it here and it hadn't changed. So I'm really sorry about that. So it's 1 Kings 11, where that is.
Yeah, and Justin, if you will, speak up. We're not. It's kind of weak. The audio is kind of weak on our end.
Okay. How about, are the rest of you guys having a hard time hearing me? Okay.
It's coming clear in California.
Okay. All righty. So I just wanted to kind of go through and point those things out, as that's really where the split occurs. And so we see the split here into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. But that's where it really started. And again, it's because of Solomon's sin, we see that this happens. And we were talking last night with Brandon and Bobby and Dorinda just about how, as the kings go, so go the people, right? And you don't hear a lot about the people and what they're doing. You hear mostly about, it's focused on the leadership. And when the leaders go sour, the people follow right behind. And you kind of see that happening here. All right. So I'm going to go into kind of start getting into phase 1 here. And again, I don't know if we'll be able to cover all this today, but I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about Jeroboam's sin, Jeroboam the first. And it's important to note, and you can see this from that timeline, that there's 2 Jeroboams that reign in the house of Israel. The first is Jeroboam, called Jeroboam the first, and he's the one who takes the reign after Solomon. Jeroboam the second is a descendant, I think, the great grandson of Jehu, and Jehu was made famous because he killed Jezebel, and who was the wife of Ahab, who caused Elijah all those problems, right? And the people of Israel. What's that? And he also killed all the sons of Ahab, and wiped them out at the command of God. And so Jehu, the Kings records that he did evil in the sight of the Lord in his days, but he did do some things the way God had commanded. And so Jeroboam the second was his great grandson, and God had promised Jehu that his line would last for 4 generations. And so Jeroboam the second is the third of that. And Jeroboam the second, we're going to focus on a little bit because Amos, most of the time he is prophesying is in Jeroboam the second's reign. And that's even mentioned in the book of Amos. So we'll spend some time there. And then those are the 5 prophets with books in the Bible that kind of cover this period of time, this phase, which is the time during the northern kingdom. So you have Amos, Jonah, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah. And the three on top there, Amos, Jonah, and Hosea, they lived in the land of Israel. But Micah, well, I'll make because Amos actually didn't, but he went to Israel. Isaiah and Micah both dwelled in Jerusalem, or near Jerusalem. They were in Judah. And so they dwelled in Judah, and much of their prophecy pertains to Judah. Hosea is mostly towards the northern kingdom. Jonah was a prophet to the nations, right? But Jonah also is mentioned and I think we're going to see that today, actually, that he is mentioned in some of these other prophets. Amos actually dwelled in Tekoa, and Tekoa was this little town south of Jerusalem. So Amos was a Jew, and he was not a prophet, and he says that in his book, that he was not a prophet, but he was told to go to Israel and to carry God's message. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And if we need another week to do this, we can. I don't know if anybody has any insights or anything else to add to what I just said about that, or any corrections, because I do make mistakes.
I might just add a little thing. Prophets were institutionalized in Judah and Israel from the time of Samuel. In fact, a lot of the judges the Jews today call early prophets, and they started schools of prophets. So when Amos says he's not a prophet nor a son of a prophet, he's saying he's not from the institutional tradition of the prophets. He's just a herdsman, is his terms, but he definitely has a prophetic gift. And if you look at the prophets in general, you have prophets from every walk of life and every tradition, actually, within Israel. That's all.
That's interesting. I'll have to look into that because I didn't know that.
Amos didn't have an MDiv.
MDiv, that's right. He was untrained.
He didn't have an MDiv, and he was a dresser of sycamore trees.
That's interesting. Yeah. He sycamore trees, and then also he was a herdsman as well. It seemed like he kind of his land he did a couple of different things.
It's interesting, in the JPS it says he's a sheep herder and a sheep breeder, actually. And when we think about the early, like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Moses were very much tied in with sheep. And then we go to the New Testament, and who are the Peter, James, and John are all fishermen, and Andrew. So God doesn't always choose what we would consider the educated. I just thought it was interesting how being a sheep herder.
Yeah. No. Yeah. Amos, I mean, it's really it just, like you say, you go through and you grow up and you read these things, but when you don't have that context, it does take away from, I think, from being able to really understand the message that those prophets were trying to carry. Geography is really important too, right? Brandon, every week, Brandon, we're on part 31 of our Samuel King's Chronicles, and we got a long ways to go, but every week we study the geography, and it's important. It's always important to understand who these the names of these cities and where these people were, and again, where they came from. And so you can kind of see that the kingdom of Israel really, really shrank down. Where you see Ammon there and Moab, that was the land that was given to 3 of the tribes who had asked Moses not to cross over and inherit the land on the other side of the Jordan, right? And that was, you guys are going to have to help me, but it was Manasseh and who else? Reuben? Anybody remember?
Gad.
Yeah. And I think Reuben, I might be making that up though. I think it was Reuben though. It was Reuben, Manasseh, and Gad, if that sounds right. And where you see Ammon and Moab, that was Israelite territory, and in the time of Solomon, Ammon and Moab did not have we're much further to the east, I think, of that. And so what you see there is probably closer to the end of I would guess, towards the end of the northern kingdom. But that land always changed. Now the Philistine states, they always were, a hindrance to Israel. From the time the judges did not cast them out, they continued to be a thorn in the side of the Israelites. And so they were always there. And then the Sidonians, the Phoenicians, I don't think they were called the Phoenicians at that time. That was probably a name given to them later. But Tyre and Sidon, you hear about all the time, kind of dwelling in that land. And then Edom was always there. And if you remember, Moses tried to pass through Edom, and they would not allow him. And so they had to go all the way around. And so most of that is there. The other thing I think is really important to point out is Damascus and the kingdom of Aram. Because where Damascus is, that country has a lot to play into this period of time with Israel, and they kind of go back and forth between being the main power and the northern kingdom being the main power, kind of in that area. And towards the beginning to middle of the northern kingdom, Assyria was nobody. It wasn't really until maybe about halfway through the northern kingdom when Assyria started becoming an empire. And eventually we're going to see next week that it's Assyria who completely takes out Damascus, and they destroy Aram and Damascus before taking Israel. And then they go through and wipe out Israel as well. So just kind of, I think those are the kinds of things that are just really helpful to know, so that when you read about God predicting or prophesying these things, that we understand where the context is and how those things happen. And again, there's many of you in here who are much better at this history than myself, so feel free to jump in and add anything to my summary there.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of the tribes, because Moab and the Ammonites, they're related to them. A lot of the tribal territory that was initially claimed was up there east of Galilee, where it says Kingdom of Aram, Damascus. So that was still a lot of land that was claimed.
And Galilee is that big body of water above the wording of Umomium. Is that right?
Yes.
Right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not familiar with Umomium.
Me neither. I am not either. But that would be the body of water that's the Sea of Galilee, right?
Yeah,
okay.
That's the Sea of Galilee. So a lot of that area east of that was claimed by the tribes initially, because they went all the way up to Bashan and conquered the Amorites there, which is, I think, mentioned. There's some mention of those things in some of the prophets and stuff. And so in Bashan was, it's hard for me to see without like the mountains and stuff, but it was up there closer to the Jordan River, whereas Damascus is further east. But a lot of that area was captured. It's also important to remember the land that's been promised Israel, that they never had all of the land that was ever promised to them. They've always been short, even under the reign of Solomon. Israelites had not conquered that land. They were just, those lands were basically vassal states to them. They were under their control, but they were not conquered. So they didn't own the land. Israel had not, gone throughout the whole land.
Yeah. All right, so let's get into what Rehoboam. Again, Rehoboam is the son of Solomon, and he takes the southern kingdom. And okay, let's make sure I'm right. I'm going to point this out, and I apologize, guys, because I've not been doing a good job of telling you where we are. So we're going to go to 1 Kings chapter 12, and I'm pretty sure I got this one right. I think it was just that one that was a mistake. So 1 Kings chapter 12. And maybe what I'll do, and Brandon, if you're okay doing it, maybe as I mention the scriptures, if you just type them into the chat, that way, because I know the other things are going on, but I think maybe that would just help us. That way, if people come in late or have to, they can see what we're doing. Let's see. I really wanted to focus on Jeroboam and kind of what's going on with him, because this is kind of the break off here, right? And so God came to Jeroboam and he told Jeroboam, he gave him a prophecy, and he basically told Jeroboam, that he was going to rip out 10 tribes from the house of David and give them to Jeroboam. And he tried to make a covenant with Jeroboam. If you do right in my eyes and you keep my commands, I will make your line last forever. It was almost the same, not the same, but very similar covenant to what he gave to David. And of course, we know Jeroboam did not do what was right in the eyes of God. And so I think this piece of scripture here is imperative to understanding what the idolatry consisted of specifically, because we always hear about the high places and the Asherim, right? And these things, but it started with these 2 golden calves that he had casted, and where he put them in Dan and in Bethel, there was reasons he chose those 2 places. And so let's go ahead and read this. And Jen, if you're okay reading, maybe I'll have you read, if you want to read 25 through 33.
But Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If this people keep going up to offer sacrifices in the house of Adonai at Jerusalem, then the heart of these people will turn back to their lord, King Rehoboam of Judah. Then they will kill me and return to King Rehoboam of Judah. So the king sought counsel and made 2 golden calves. He said to them, you have been going up to Jerusalem long enough. Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. Then he set up one in Bethel and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin for the people who went to worship before the one even up in Dan. He also made shrines in the high places and appointed priests from among the people who were not sons of Levi. Then Jeroboam instituted a festival in the, oh wait, am I supposed to stop there?
No, keep going through 33.
Then Jeroboam instituted a festival in the 8th month on the 15th day of the month, imitating the festival that is in Judah. He went up to the altar that he built in Bethel to sacrifice to the calves that he made. He installed in Bethel the priests of the high places that he made. Then he went up to the altar which he had made in Bethel on the 15th day in the 8th month, in the month that he had made up from his own heart, and made up a festival for the children of Israel, and went up to the altar to burn incense.
So the placement of putting them in Bethel and Dan, and Brandon and Riva and Dexter's, anybody who can help me with the geography. I do know, let me pull out mine. I do know that Bethel would have been right kind of around there. Does that look right?
Bethel is Bethel, John says. I don't know.
Yeah. And then Dan, I'm not sure where Dan is, but I know it was somewhere up north, if I remember correctly. That Dan was kind of the northernmost tribe, if I'm remembering correctly.
Can I bring up something else? It's interesting that Jeroboam was of the tribe of Ephraim.
Mm-hmm.
And the northern kingdom is frequently, it's called that. It's either called Israel or Ephraim. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, and I wonder, Elizabeth, if that's the reason that Ephraim takes kind of a name to really talk about the entire northern kingdom, if it's because of Jeroboam.
It might be, but then the prophecy about Ephraim said he'd be the father of many nations. Just interesting. So.
Yeah, very interesting. And so the point here, by putting this one here, was to cut off people's route to Jerusalem. And so instead of having them go down to Jerusalem and, by going down to Jerusalem worshiping God, aligning themselves with Judah, which was Jeroboam's fear, he gave them a place. And Brandon mentioned yesterday that if you go up to Dan, to this day, you can see the ruins of a replica temple. Was it in Dan that you mentioned that, Brandon?
Yeah. The whole complex was I didn't I mean, I knew that they had stuff up there. I just didn't. I mean, they had the giant altar, the temple steps are still there, the foundation of the temple is there. There's nothing standing on it, but you can see where everything was. And it's just kind of amazing. That, I mean, he wanted to recreate what was in Jerusalem, so people wouldn't go to Jerusalem.
Right. Down to the sacrifices and the feasts. They kept this feast the same way. But it was evil in the sight of the Lord, because in his Torah, we know Jerusalem was the place that people were supposed to congregate for the feasts, for three of those feasts.
Did anyone notice what he said about the calves? Go back to Exodus. It's an exact quote. Almost.
Yeah, about the golden calves. About the golden calves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is your God who brought you up out of the land of Egypt. I mean, yeah.
It's exactly what Aaron said, right?
Pardon?
It's exactly what Aaron. I mean, you're right,
yeah.
Elizabeth.
Yeah.
Word for word. I mean, Aaron said the exact. This is your God.
Yeah. Who brought you up?
And that's kind of one of the things I think that really, when I was talking with friends about Christmas and Easter and those, this was one of the scriptures that really, really stood out to me. What you're referring to, the one in Exodus, and this as well.
And then also that he instituted a different festival because he didn't want them to go down to Jerusalem. If what I understand, Constantine didn't want to talk to the Jews about when Passover was going to be, so he decided when Easter was going to be. Just interesting.
Yeah. And again, he did everything, but he changed a little, right? Yeah. That's supposed to take place on the 15th of the 10th month. He established it in the 8th month, and that's what Satan is so good at, is counterfeit, right? The idea of counterfeit is it should look so real that unless you're trained, you cannot tell the difference. And it takes a trained eye to understand what counterfeit is. And that's what Satan is so good at. He doesn't change much. He changes just a little, just enough, so that people are deceived.
And I think it's interesting. Isn't that the festival of Sukkot? Yeah. And for those of us that are looking forward to the Messianic age, etc., to me, it kind of all fits in there. It's very interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point, Elizabeth.
And there's also the connection that we see even into the New Testament, in the discourse with the Samaritans, right? And they're talking about how they practice things, and Yeshua corrects them, right? And he's like, no, salvation comes from the Jews. It's not. Basically, they were practicing things the wrong way, and they're still even doing things today. I mean, they still have Passover and everything, but they're doing things even up to this day. The Samaritans are doing them wrong. Not that the individual things they do are the wrong way. It's just that they're not doing it the way God said, which was at the temple in Jerusalem.
Let me add something on the golden calves. The golden calves themselves were not worshipped. The calf was a representative of what the gods would come in on. So archaeologically, they found an Egyptian god riding on a golden calf and so forth. But in the Exodus and the time of the negotiations with Pharaoh, they negotiated with Pharaoh, and Pharaoh didn't buy it, to take their cattle with them out to worship along with their children and so forth. So the idea of the golden calf connected to the Exodus is that their cattle had to go with them, which was their livelihood, and the invisible God rode out on their cattle. That's kind of the narrative of the golden calf, and it's kind of borne out archaeologically and somewhat with negotiation with Pharaoh.
Now, when you say that it wasn't actually worshipped, but it was considered an idol. I mean, it was made into an idol. When Aaron did it, I mean, God would have seen that as idolatry, correct?
Yeah, God would, but the people coming out of Egypt with their cattle,
they didn't see it that way.
They didn't see it that way because they were herdsmen also.
Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure, because you're talking about just a matter of perspective, saying that from the people, they didn't see it as idolatry. To them, it was a representation of God. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, but the 10 Commandments is very clear that you don't make an image to anything or of any animal or anything in the heavens above or the earth beneath, or and then make a festival around that and commune with that. So from God's point of view, it was definitely idolatry. From their point of view, it was the Exodus narrative, like you see here.
I'm going to completely question that a bit, because they really had what we would call a sexual kind of orgy going on during that time, which was the heathen way of worshiping. And I see that now in both the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. They say they don't worship the images, but whenever you make an image of God, you're limiting him, plus you are in a way worshiping him, because God says you shall not bow down yourself to them. And whether or not, quote, you're worshiping, but anyway, so.
Yeah, I don't see anything wrong with what you say.
Yeah. And that's what I was asking, Reva, because to me it does seem like it's a clear act of idolatry, but you know, when Aaron makes that statement, here is your God, or he's referring to Jehovah. He's not trying to, or Yahweh, you know, whatever you want to say, but yeah. He's not trying to replace him. He's trying to represent him. And I think that, you know, but it clearly, I agree with Elizabeth that clearly it was an act of idolatry, just as this was. And you know, without getting into much of the semantics.
Human beings tend to worship their own experience and their own livelihood. Yeah. They loop back on themselves and they worship their past. Yeah, they are afraid of the future. They make gods of good fortune and luck and prosperity, and sexuality and fertility. That's the whole thing with Ashtoreth and so forth. So they loop on their own sexuality. Instead of their sexuality being the fruit of their being, they make their sexuality the root of their being. And so they make themselves basically their God.
Yeah.
And anytime you try to represent, I will be who I will be, you put God in a box and limit him. Yeah. And it becomes idolatry because it's not who God really is that you're worshiping.
Yeah. And so you see, you know, Jeroboam was the beginning of the end, you know, for the northern kingdom, and not the end forever, you know, because Hosea, we're going to read, I think, if we can get to it, makes it clear that in the place where it was said, you are not my people, right? And that's what, and we talked a little bit last night. I think Bobby or Dorinda, one of you, I think Bobby, you mentioned replacement theology, and we talked about, you know, that's very common knowledge, I think, in this group, just this idea that the Gentiles replaced Israel. And you know, Hosea makes it very clear that in the place where you said you are not my people, you will be said you are sons of the living God. So yes, God gave them a writ of divorce, but that doesn't mean it's the end. It's just a phase in the story. So all right, so we're gonna jump over to 2 Kings. and 2 Kings 14, I believe, if I'm right, and let me know if I'm not. And so we're jumping, and I'll show you what's great about having these timelines, is that you can physically at least get a representation of where we're going. So we're jumping from here all the way over here. Okay, and you can see Amos kind of down there, smack in the middle. And again, this is, some of these things are we can't say with 100% accuracy of where they're at, but some of them can. We do know that it was right around this time that Jonah was alive, because I'm pretty sure it's Amos who mentions Jonah by name. And Jonah obviously went to Nineveh, which again, that was at the time when Assyria was really just a kingdom. They weren't the kingdom at that point. And Damascus was much a stronger kingdom, I think, in the eyes of the world at that point. And they repent, and so God spares them. But we learn a little bit later in Nahum, but that they eventually, and just from history, that Nineveh eventually was destroyed and completely taken over. And we'll get there. A couple of things that I just want to point out, because again, as I was going through and doing my study, I really felt like this was helpful. This kind of period here marks really great suffering and a lot of turmoil for both kingdoms, for the northern and the southern kingdom. But the northern kingdom specifically was really being crunched down geographically by the surrounding nations. And during that time, there was great turmoil in the house of Israel from all the surrounding nations. And Israel was very, very small geographically at that point. They had conceded a lot of land, and they were paying tribute to a bunch of different, and they were very poor during that time. And we're going to read here that about Jeroboam very quickly, but Jeroboam is not really talked about much in Scripture. But it is noted by many biblical scholars that this period right here was probably the greatest, if you combine the assets and just the richness of both the northern and the southern kingdom. That area, that reign where Jeroboam and Uzziah were reigning simultaneously, is probably the greatest that Israel was since the time of Solomon. And so what you see Solomon, and that's the biggest Israel ever was as a nation, physically and rich in wealth. They were the center of the world at that time, in Solomon's time. And then you see power start to kind of fade away, and Israel just becomes some other nation, from the perspective of the world. It gets worse and worse and worse. And basically God hears or sees, and he decides to grant them his favor. And so Jeroboam and Uzziah together, not necessarily working together, but apart from each other, they both basically begin to take back their kingdom. And they have great successes, both in war and economics. And there's this great period of wealth and relative peace for the people of Israel during this time. And so when Amos goes in and he begins prophesying these things, I think it's noteworthy to note that they were experiencing great peace and prosperity during this time, such as had not been seen since the time of Solomon. And so just like, in modern America, I think that's something that we can relate to, right? As being, the center of the world in some respects. When you hear about or think about, judgment coming, this people very much so thought that they had God's approval, because when they looked around and saw their prosperity, right, they think just like we do today, God is on our side. And so Amos was really the first prophet to come out and say, no, that's not the case. God is going to bring judgment against you. And so I just think that that's worth noting, because after that is when things really start to get really bad for both Judah and Israel, but Israel for sure the most.
I think it's interesting in 2 Kings 13, 22, it talks about how God was merciful to them, turned back to them for the sake of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he refrained from destroying them. So many people that neglect the house of Israel don't even talk about it. I don't think don't realize that God still considers them children of Israel, children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right.
So.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Again, just, I mean, it's so important to understand, that foundational idea that that the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, God's still, they're both are still his people. But it plays out a little bit differently for them. And so again, Jeroboam was the great grandson of Jehu, the third in the generation. His son would be the last in the line of Jehu. And after that, the kingdom would be ripped out of Jehu. And I think it's Hosea that actually talks about that in Hosea 1. So it says he restored, this is in, again, we're in 2 Kings 14, verse 25. He, being Jeroboam the second, restored the border of Israel from the entrance of Hamath as far as the sea of the Arabah, according to the word of the Lord, the God of Israel, which he spoke through his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai. I don't know how to say that. Amittai, the prophet who was of Gath Hepher. For the Lord saw the affliction of Israel, which was very bitter, for there was neither bond nor free, nor was there any helper for Israel. So that to me sounds very similar to what you read in the Judges. I mean, when you read Judges, it kind of has that same feel to it, that it was just hopeless, right? And they were just, they were really the bottom of the low of the low. The Lord did not say, I think this is very interesting that it says here, the Lord did not say he would blot out the name of Israel from under heaven, but he saved them by the hand of Jeroboam, the son of Joash. And Brandon, did we read this yesterday, or is this what we're going to read next week?
I read that yesterday.
And what did you say about that? You had something to say about that yesterday. I can't remember what it was.
Well, we were reading about kind of how we had Elisha leave before that.
That's right.
And
I'll be right back.
how Elisha represented Yahweh in many aspects in the spiritual battle that was going on. And with Elisha's death, he was called the chariots and horsemen of Israel. When he died, and when they placed it in that position they did in the text, it was it's like a sign that God's hand, that he's leaving Israel, that he's not, that they're on their way down. Not that they're done for yet. And so, like, we get this thing right here, that Yahweh did not say he would blot out the name of Israel. Well, no, like, he didn't say that, but like his hand on them, with Elisha dying, he was actively fighting for what they call Yahwism, which is the worship of Yahweh in the land of Israel, instead of the foreign gods with the Baals and Asherim. God was basically pulling his hand away and not fighting that spiritual battle anymore. But he didn't say he was going to destroy them. So we get that little side text there. Like, oh, he didn't say this was the end just yet.
Yeah, it's just really kind of interesting that the narrator, the person writing this, that they really wanted to make that distinction there. I thought that was interesting. Anyway, you can see kind of, that it does talk a little bit about what Jeroboam did for Israel. Again, really, I should say what God did for Israel through Jeroboam, that he restored many of those boundaries that they had given, away to the nations. And so again, it's good to kind of know what's going on there. We are focused on the minor prophets, but really, I think it would, for us to not include some of the highlights of what the major prophets have to say and how it's in line, I think we'd be doing a disservice. So, I will definitely kind of bring in a little bit of, and again, the major prophets being Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and Hosea. I think those five are considered the major prophets. But Hosea it's just an incredible book, and it's probably one of my favorites when it comes to the prophets, because just again, the story of the gospel is writ throughout Hosea. God's mercy, his patience that you just see, but also his willingness to discipline even the people whom he loves, and kind of the overall plan at the end of the day, for Israel and for redemption for the whole earth is going to happen through Israel. And again, as Paul says, we are grafted into Israel, right? So that's when we talk about Israel, it's not necessarily just physical Israel, it's Israel and all who are grafted in. So Hosea is told to go take a wife who's a harlot, and through her, his children are conceived and born to her. We're going to focus on verse 6. And again, so we're in Hosea 1, and it says she, I think Gomer was her name. No, that's not right. It was Gomer. Yeah, I was right. It is Gomer. So Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, I guess you would say. But that's her. And so it says, then she conceived again and gave birth to a daughter, and the Lord said, name him. I always find that interesting. Has anybody ever caught that before? That it was a daughter, and she said, and the Lord, I'm sorry. The Lord said to him, name her, I misread that, I'm sorry. Lo Ruhamah, for I will no longer have compassion on the house of Israel, that I would ever forgive them. But I will have compassion on the house of Judah, and deliver them by the Lord their God, and will not deliver them by bow, sword, battle, horses, or horsemen. When she had weaned Lo Ruhamah, she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said, name him Lo Ami, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Again, Hosea 1, 8 and 10, 8, 9, and 10 is, or I'm sorry, 8 and 9 is one of the verses I remember hearing. I remember sitting in church on a Sunday and somebody talking about the Gentile church. And they were talking about how God's working, kind of, and what age we're living in. And this is the verse they used. And they stopped after 9 and talked about how this is God, beginning to kind of set the people of Israel aside and move on to the next dispensation, right? And when you don't read the entire thing, it's just, it's incredible how much of the story you miss. And so verse 10 says, yet the number of the sons of Israel will be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in that place where it was said to them, you are not my people, it will be said to them, you are sons of the living God. And the sons of Judah and the sons of Israel will be gathered together, and they will appoint for themselves one leader. And they will go up from the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. And so Jezreel, in this sense, I think is synonymous with judgment. It's referred to in other scriptures as the valley of judgment. Jezreel was the name of the place where, Brandon, tell me if I'm wrong, Jezebel, that's where she was. That's the city that she was in when Jehu went to basically kill her and begin kind of the judgment on Ahab's sons.
Yeah, my brain, I don't, that was like 2 weeks ago.
I know. I'll have to look it up.
Is in the valley of Jezreel.
The Jezreel Valley.
Armageddon.
Yeah,
yes,
so
thank you.
Valley, and Samaria was on the Jezreel Valley. The cities weren't in the valley; they were up on the side. Most of them, at least. Megiddo is actually in the valley, although it's a noun. But most of the cities are up on the sides of the valley, where they're protected on the mountainsides. But Jezreel is the valley there.
And as John just said, you said Megiddo, and Harmageddon comes from that root word Megiddo. So that's where Armageddon is supposed to take place, according to Ezekiel, I believe.
Yeah. Which ties this name Jezreel into that final judgment, battle judgment, you might say.
Which is a big part of the day of the Lord, which we're going to focus on through this study too, right? And John and Elizabeth and they, you know, we've talked about that a lot, right? The day of the Lord and what that is. But Jezreel, John, I think what you're trying to say is Jezreel here is really being tied to the day of the Lord and that final judgment on the nations that's talked about throughout the prophets. Is that what you're saying?
That's what it sounds like to me.
It's interesting that the JPS has a footnote that then brings us, at least in the Jewish Bible, to Hosea 2, 23 and 24, which they say is a promise, and they shall respond to Jezreel. So it's kind of like judgment is being also a promise.
Mm-hmm.
And again, when you're following God, it's good news. Anyway, I just thought it was interesting because we think of it as bad necessarily.
Right. But the day of the Lord is a day, will be a day of salvation for those who he chooses.
Yeah.
And so it will be bad for some people, but it depends on which side of the coin you're on, I guess, right?
Yeah, because it says, and they shall respond to Jezreel. I will sow her in the land of my own and take her back in favor. And I will say, you are my people. He will respond, you are my God.
Yeah. And it's important, I think, Hosea is a big book and there's a lot in there. But Hosea 1, I wanted to bring out because one, we know Hosea, this was his time. He was a king. He was a prophet in Israel during these days. And when Amos was written, they would have been, I don't know if you'd call them contemporaries, but right around the same time as each other, or very close to it if they weren't, on the same timeline. So the things that they were saying were very similar. And again, when they're saying these things, Israel is living in a time of great prosperity. And so that gives you kind of a mindset of why people didn't want to hear, nor did they tend to believe anything that they were saying.
So I put a map up there so that people could see where it is. On the chat, you can download it if you want to. Also, I wanted to point out, though, that we say Jezreel, but it's, if any of you all know Hebrew, you know that there's a lot of times play on words and things that sound similar to each other. And in Hebrew, it's Yitzrael, right? Which sounds a lot like
Israel.
Yeah. Even though it's spelled with it is different. But it does spell. It has the same sound. It sounds the same in many ways. So yeah, it was the city where the vineyard where he took it over. So if anybody needs a map, I just did a little map up there. Also, I want to let y'all know I threw a PDF up there if anybody wants to download it and read it later. It talks about, it's a really good article about the Gentiles in Israel. So.
If you move on to Hosea 2, and again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and this is what I would call supplemental reading for this. But Hosea 2, again, talking about those kind of 5 themes that stand out from the Song of Moses, just after the judgment of Israel and the things that God's going to do to judge Israel, which is really kind of these first 13 verses here, talks about the things Israel did wrong, right? Their acts of harlotry and the judgment that will come as a result. It talks about the restoration of Israel. And so I as I was going through and reading this, you almost see, what I would call an antithesis to the forms of judgment that God talks about throughout his prophets and in the Song of Moses. And again, I'm in Hosea 2. But in 2:18, he says, in that day, I will also make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky and the creeping things of the ground. And we know, Isaiah talks about the lion and the lamb dwelling together, that there will be peace among animals with one another, but also peace of the animals with humans. And so animals that generally are predatory animals towards humans sometimes, not often, but sometimes, will no longer be. And then I will abolish the bow, the sword, and the war from the land. Right. And so this form of judgment will disappear for a period of time up until the end. Right. And then you have in verse 21, I will respond to the heavens and they will respond to the earth. So this idea of rain will come in its season. And that's scripture. You know, there's a number of times, right? I will give the land its rain in its seasons. When it's supposed to rain, it will rain. Not too much to where there's flooding, because flooding is another way, you know, that can harm the earth. And not too little, just the right amount of rain in the seasons. And the earth will respond to the grain, to the new wine and the oil, and they will respond to Jezreel. Again, Jezreel. And Brandon, from what you're saying, it almost sounds to me like Jezreel is maybe be synonymous with Israel. Maybe that's in that context, it might be just calling Jezreel, but really referring to Israel in the same way that it's done with Ephraim and other areas.
Yeah, I'm not sure. All I know is that the words sound the same. So like Israel is spelled with a shin, and Yitzrael is spelled with the zade. I think it's zade there. I think so. Anyway, so there's like a letter difference, but it's basically the equivalent of us putting a Z in the place of an S, or an S in the place of a Z. They have a different word, and it's a different place.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at how Samaria is pretty much synonymous with Israel, with the northern kingdom, and it's in the Jezreel Valley, then we kind of see how those may be connected. I wouldn't say like we have to read it and say, oh no, whenever we see Jezreel, we should say Israel. But you know, a lot of times we see things that should make us think about other things as well. So if we see Jezreel, it should automatically trigger, like I was thinking about Israel, you know, the northern kingdom.
So I think that kind of gets us in a good place to begin talking about the book of Amos. It's 11:18, and our goal is to try to keep this to 90 minutes. I think that's kind of one of the things that we had tried to agree on when we do the study. So this might be a natural stopping point. We can try to start Amos for the next 10 minutes, or we can stop here, and the next time we meet, maybe that's what our focus will be on. Is maybe just kind of cutting through. And you know, Amos is a long book, 9 chapters, and so I'm sure a lot of people I'm sure we read it, but you know, it might be good to have another couple weeks to go back and dive in and find some things. And if not, you have it read and we can look at it. I kind of wanted to look at the whole book of Amos just because I think it's a good place to start with one whole book. One of the minor prophets, and it's one of the longer ones in the minor prophets. I'm not sure that, and we can maybe we just take. And again, I'm open to whatever you guys think is going to be the best. If we want to, you know, take a week and spend on Amos, and then if we want to do that with every minor prophet, or maybe just as we're going through, kind of sprinkle in the minor prophets when they kind of match the themes and the things that we're talking about. So I'm open up to any feedback you guys, and I guess what I'm saying is you guys want to stop here, and next week that could be the focus, is the entire book of Amos, or do we just want to kind of talk for maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes, go a little bit over, and then kind of move on next session?
Well, a little bit over.
Yeah, we're new, so we're excited over here. I've got something that I think might be profitable. I'm going to read from 1 Corinthians 10:6. I'm sure you're familiar with it, but let me read. Now these things occurred as examples to keep us from setting our hearts on evil things as they did. And he's speaking of what we're reading right now, you know, because Paul was looking back and saying, hey guys, look what happened. And so these things were for examples. And it said, and Paul goes on to say, do not be idolaters, as some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and got up and to indulge in pagan revelry. We should not commit sexual or morality, as some of them did, and in the day, and on the day that 23,000 of them died. So fundamentally, this leads us to a practical application of everything that we're studying. That's what Paul is trying to get at here. He's trying to point the believers in Corinth to consider the history that we're dealing with. And for me, over the years, I've come to look at things in terms of something I mentioned last night, that we're talking about Jeroboam, the Jeroboam 1 and 2, and then we're talking about Amos, and then we haven't read anything about the priest in these particular passages. But the way that I look at this is that I think about the personal, how this applies to me personally. But what we're reading is an account of these Jeroboam characters, these two kings. They were in charge. Their task was civil government. They were actually leading the nation of Israel in this case, in terms of civil government and military. And so the compromises that I think that they made was, as civil governments and kings, and of course kings are always aggressive to pile up credit for conquering lands, for bringing the nation to material prosperity. You see, that's what, and we know that Jeroboam 1 got in trouble because he basically had a tax revolt between Jeroboam and Rehoboam. Rehoboam got bad tax advice and was heavily taxing the 10 tribes, the northern tribes. Therefore, there was a split because they, so we're actually reading an account, in addition to the spiritual implications here, we're reading about the fact that here's the civil government, the head of a civil government of Israel was adapting or accommodating the nation Israel to things that he wanted to do in terms of civil government, expanding the land and all that, and having lower taxes or whatever. And then it's been mentioned the fact that what happened with Constantine, same thing. And the way we got in trouble as a people of God is we've got to watch civil government leaders that are not listening to the prophets and the priest. And so I just think in terms of personal application, what if our present civil government leaders understood this and really took it seriously? How different would their governing be as civil servants? How so in terms of there's a whopping application here to our modern context. And so when we read this, we need to be looking, I think, I like to anyway look at the implications of not only the personal, but the civil social applications, and what has happened through history. And again, one example is Constantine. And here we are trying to recover the Torah observance and trying to recover the feast days and a number of other things that went south as a result of a civil leader. you see, in the person of Constantine.
Mhm.
So it's just really powerful. What we're reading is really powerful in terms of application to right now, right here, right now.
To add on to that, I think when you see how God established it, first there was the priest and there was the king, and they were never to be the same.
Right.
And I think that whenever we get we give religious power to the government, both the government and the religion, they suffer from it. And God set that up very distinctly. And we see when Nathan would come to David and really say, you did wrong, David would say, yes, I'm sorry, so that he had given David the civil authority and the priests and the prophets the authority from God. I mean, not that David didn't follow God too, but there was definitely a distinction. And then we see with Solomon, when he started setting up all these extra idols, etc., there's kind of a blending. That's just my thoughts on that.
Well, no question, there's a separation between church and state, so to speak, in the nation Israel, and that's our model, frankly. That there is a separation, but it's not a dichotomous separation to the point where civil leaders shouldn't be listening to the priest and to the prophets. In our time, the prophets are like the press, if I could make a kind of a crass parallel. In other words, it's like the civil government or the civil leaders in this case, in the case of Jeroboam 1 and 2 and the other kings, it was incumbent because they were under God, because they were accountable to God according to the Torah. They had to be listening. They had a different function, but nevertheless they were still under the authority of the God of the universe. And so inasmuch as they had a different function in terms of civil governing, they nevertheless couldn't carry out that function without reference and input from the Word of God or the Torah and the prophets. You see, so I think that's the point to be considered.
Yeah. And we need to make sure we don't make God in our image,
Yes.
that we follow what he said.
Amen.
Yeah. But I mean, and you mentioned the press, but that's a lot of the prophets, right? That the kings would put in their courts, right? They were not giving the king God's advice. They were just telling him what they wanted to hear, and
Right.
they were telling the people what they wanted to hear. And that's what Micaiah, right? The story of Micaiah and how he came into Ahab, and Ahab didn't want to hear it, right? And I think it was Jehoshaphat, I can't remember, but it was the southern kingdom who said, well, let's hear the prophet that actually has the ear of God. And so it is. I think you both make great points. And I mean, gosh, if we just did half of what we're reading here, or didn't do the half that we're not supposed to be doing as a nation, right? We would be in probably a lot better place in the eyes of God. I agree with you.
That's what the Bible is, the living, breathing word of God. I mean, it can affect, it was for them back then. And then we take it in a contemporary, both understand what happened then, and then how do we apply it to ourselves. So I really like that.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, I mean, if you guys are okay with it and maybe sticking around this for another week, I'd love to, break down Amos and go into Amos and spend some time in there. I think it would do well to spend a week in there. I mean, this is, after all, a study of the minor prophets. So, and then we can decide, like I said, I'm not against doing that with every single book. I mean, if we studied Amos the way, some of us wanted to, and myself included, we could probably spend 7 weeks on Amos, just Amos, but again, I think that my goal and the goal that you guys seem to be in line with is just let's kind of maybe have an overview, right, of the prophets and what's going on current affairs during that time. And then if we want to go back and do a more in-depth study, we can. But if you guys are okay with that, I think that's what we'll do next time, is spend an entire session on the book of Amos.
Thank you so much for putting all this history and geography together. It's confusing. Thank you.
It is. And yeah, and I apologize for the, I've got like a whirlwind with my notes kind of going back and forth here, and it makes you dizzy both physically and metaphorically. So, but again, they're there, and my wife just showed me that where my jottings are not necessarily in line on some of them. So I apologize if they're off. But hopefully it's helping. I know we didn't talk much about the actual prophets today, but I do think that the geography, the state of affairs in the area are all very important to understanding what exactly the minor prophets are trying to get at, and more specifically what God is speaking to.
It's so hard when we take everything out of context to understand what was being said. And
Yeah.
so, thank you.
Yeah.
It would be helpful if it's possible, if you could email your notes to us so we could go ahead and print them out, because the screens are moving a lot and sometimes they're so far away that I can't read the small stuff. So if we could print those out and have a couple of days to go over them.
Yeah.
Is that
So,
okay?
yeah, absolutely, Dorinda. And I probably should have sent an email out. I actually did. So the link that I gave to you, and the link that I gave to the rest of you guys, that's a live link. And what that means is, as I make updates to this document, those updates will occur on your link as well, in real time. And so if you go in there right now, and I actually put these in on Friday. Friday was when I put them in. But what I will try to do, Dorinda, is as I finish notes, put them into the document and then email you guys and let you know that they're there. And then, and that way you can access them maybe a day or two ahead of time and print them out if you'd like to have them printed out, or at least have the document open so that you can kind of follow along with me as I'm going. Absolutely.
So for some reason I can't, I just sent you an email actually like 10 minutes ago, but for some reason I can't get the link to work for me.
The Bitly one is not working for you?
Yeah, not for me. I don't know if I'm just doing something wrong. It like, it's weird. It acts like it asks me, do you want to leave YouTube? And then I tell it yes. And then
all right, so you're accessing the one that's on YouTube.
it seems that I am. I'm going to try to go back to YouTube maybe.
Okay, so stick around after this and I'll put a link in the chat and let's see if we can get that to work, if you have a couple minutes to spare.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, awesome. So next week we'll cover Amos. We will, after that, where we're going to go, just so you guys know, kind of in the short term, after that, we're going to get into the Assyrian captivity of Samaria and talk just a little bit about the history around that, and then just look at Amos and Hosea specifically and what they had to say. Micah even gets into that a little bit. And so we'll focus on what those prophets actually had to say about that many, many years before it happened, and then how that actually happened. And I think that even, like we talked about, gives you context when Yeshua is talking to the Samaritans, specifically the woman at the well. The things he has to say to her, so much of that is wrapped up into that history of how Assyria handled that, that exile. So that's where we're going after that. And I think that'll wrap up phase one, or part one of the first phase, I guess I should say. Or maybe it's phase one of the first part. I can't remember. But anyway, thank you so much for taking an hour and a half out of your guys' day. And hopefully this is, I know, like I said, there's a lot of bouncing around. And so I will definitely try to get those notes out to you guys ahead of time so that you can kind of see kind of where we're trying to go. And maybe even what I'll try to do is notate in the notes, kind of give a little bit more direction on where I'm going and kind of what I'm thinking, so that you can see that too. Because right now it's just a jobble of scripture with some annotations kind of in there. But yeah.
And can I ask who Dorinda and Duncan, is that
Yes.
it?
Yeah. So
are they from Colorado or are they from North Carolina?
Yeah,
or where?
yeah, yeah. So I introduced them at the beginning, but and Dorinda and Bobby, I'll give you a chance to tell us a little bit about yourselves. But they came to Brandon and I's group here in North Carolina yesterday, and they've been looking for a group. It sounds like for quite a while. They're from the Dallas area, and they've been out here for a few years. And so they drove 35 minutes out of their way to bless us with their presence last night. And they were so excited that they heard me and Brandon talking about today, and they said, "Well, can we jump in?" And I, of course, this is always open to anybody. So yeah, Bobby and Dorinda, if you don't mind, just sharing just a little bit about you guys and where you're from, and then we'll cut it out for the day.
Well, I am speaking for myself. I'm from a northern province of Cuba called Miami, Florida.